Property Podcast. I'm Simon, and I've been investing in property for over 20 years. And if you're an active landlord or planning your next property investment, this podcast is for you. I hope you enjoy this episode, or at least find it useful. And I would really appreciate it if you could tell a couple of other property people about the Business of Property podcast. This episode is coming out a week after the budget. So I'm sure you've seen a million emails, news articles, or probably even heard podcasts about the budget already. But there was something in the budget, in the small print of the budget document, that will affect landlords, especially smaller landlords, that I don't think many people have been mentioning. So I'm recording this fairly short episode to highlight that point, really. After going over that, though, I will also include a very quick summary of the main sort of budget points for property people, just in case you haven't heard them yet. So the point that I think a lot of people haven't been talking about, which I feel is important, is making tax digital. And here specifically for property people, I'm talking about making tax digital for income tax and self-assessment. So this is the bit of making tax digital, because there are lots of different elements to it, but this is the bit that is particularly for people who own small businesses, as in self-employment businesses, or property businesses, and obviously have to, from those things, complete a self-assessment tax return every year. So in the property element specifically, this is affecting people who own property in their personal names. So if you own property exclusively in limited companies, then this particular element of making tax digital won't be affecting you. So in the budget, the government recommitted to the existing making tax digital schedule. So just to recap quickly, that means that property businesses with income over £50,000 per year, and this is income, not profit, so it's just the total receipts for the business in a year, those businesses, or those people with those businesses, will need to submit quarterly returns via a making tax digital system from April 2026. And property businesses with income over £30,000, so this is now a lower limit, will need to submit quarterly returns for a making tax digital system from April 2027, so a year later from the higher level. And while the government have recommitted to that schedule and their enthusiasm for streamlining tax and digitizing systems for better efficiency, they also extended making tax digital to say that property businesses with income over 20,000 will be brought into the same making tax digital requirements, so quarterly returns through a making tax digital compatible system, before the end of the current parliament. So they haven't put an exact date on it. My guess is that it would be April 2028, probably, to follow the same pattern as the others, but they haven't actually put a specific date on it. But they have said that they do intend to bring that in before the end of the current parliament, so within the next 5 years. Now, done right, making tax digital for property will be very quick, very easy, and will probably help people discover ways to work more efficiently. But I do know that a lot of landlords are very concerned about making tax digital. They're concerned that it's going to force them to do a lot of extra work, and that it's going to be complicated, and maybe other things that are actually quite unfounded, such as that it might lead to paying tax quarterly and things like that. Currently, the payment of tax is not affected at all by making tax digital. It's merely the provision of information to HMRC on an earlier and quarterly basis. But to try and allay some of those fears, I thought I might just quickly explain how making tax digital works in PATMA. So each quarter, PATMA sends an email saying your making tax digital submission is due. From that, you log into PATMA, you review the figures that are there ready to be submitted to HMRC, and you click the button to submit them. And that's it. It really is that simple, and only takes a few moments every quarter. And there's nothing more to it. So the making tax digital element of it is really, really very simple, very straightforward, and definitely not something to be concerned about. You do need to keep digital records, and that just means that you need to stay up to date with your transactions each month, really. But you would have to do that anyway, because you'd have to be recording this information somewhere, somehow, so you have those figures for your tax return at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, when you work out your sort of more traditional tax return, you would have to be collecting those figures together somewhere. Whether you're adding them up on a sheet of paper or whether you're typing them into a spreadsheet, you're still collecting those figures together. And under a Making Tax Digital scheme, you just have to do that slightly earlier. It's the same amount of effort, same amount of time. So there's nothing extra in terms of keeping track of your relevant figures. And then the actual submission process, as I just talked through, is really, really simple and really does only take a few moments. So with that exciting element that has been missed from a lot of people's write-ups from the budget, I am just going to very quickly run through the other elements that were in the budget that lots of people are talking about that are affecting property people. Now, the first one is, of course, the biggest one, which is the stamp duty change. And this is a change to the second home surcharge. It has increased to 5%. So that's from 3%, an increase of 2%. But the important figure is that it is now 5% extra. And this is clearly going to put some people off. And it is going to sort of reduce people who are choosing to invest in property a little bit. And of course, people who have been caught in this very rapid change to that are now worrying about whether it's going to affect their current purchases and maybe having to renegotiate prices and sort of share that load perhaps with the seller as well. But there's added complications there. But in the long term, this is just going to become something that investors have to factor in. And for example, in Scotland, there's already a 6% second home charge. So England's now is 5%. So it's not quite as high as Scotland. And people are still investing in rental properties in Scotland, and it does still work. It just means you need to factor that into your calculations and be aware of it going forwards. Of course, where properties are more expensive, so in London, in the southeast, the actual pounds amount of this effect is going to be much higher, and perhaps it will have more of an effect in those areas. But generally speaking, it's just a new thing to factor in. I don't think it's going to be a game changer. It's just another thing to be aware of. And of course, for existing holdings, existing portfolios, it's not going to change anything. It only matters when you actually come to make those sale or purchase transactions. Capital gains tax. Now, largely this was a non-event for property investors. So while that was good news, of course, the general capital gains tax rates have been increased. So if you're also making money on shares, you might be less pleased. Inheritance tax, another tax with lots of pre-budget speculation for some major changes. But again, mostly a non-event. The actual changes turned out to be frozen limits for another couple of years, so bringing more people into scope over time, and bringing pensions into scope. So a lot of people I know have been keen on promoting pensions as a way to help with inheritance tax, and of course that's no longer going to work. There were also some changes to business and farm reliefs, but I'm not going to go into those here. Employers' national insurance. Now this is one that's probably the biggest sort of main headline point, but it's not directly property related. However, of course, a lot of property businesses do employ people. So if that's the case for you, then this is going to be important to you. Now, the rate of employers' national insurance is increasing to 15% from next April. And the threshold where you start paying employers' national insurance per employee is being lowered to £5,000 per year. So that's £5,000 of employee salary is the trigger point for where you have to start paying employers' national insurance. However, the employment allowance is being extended to £10,500. So I think this means that a business doesn't actually pay any employer's national insurance until their national insurance bill exceeds £10,500, even if you've got employees who are earning over £5,000. So you would normally be liable for paying that employer's national insurance. So the idea is that smaller businesses may actually not feel the impact of this at all. Energy efficiency support also featured in the budget. And here, this isn't sort of directly affecting people, individuals per se. However, the government have stated that they plan to make it a requirement for rental properties to be EPC C by 2030. This is something that's not in the budget. This is something they've said previously. And they haven't actually made that law yet, but they have stated that they're going to, so we have to assume that that will happen. So the things that were in the budget were under sort of energy efficiency support was an extension to the boiler upgrade scheme and other support in this area that I think will hopefully be a positive move and hopefully benefit landlords and tenants in being able to reach EPCC for more properties by the deadline that they're aiming for. Then a couple of other really short headlines is the government is continuing to push planning reform. They've included money for extra people to actually process things through the planning system. So hopefully that's good news. There's also some extra money and a push for more affordable homes. Fuel duty was frozen, so that might affect you if you're driving around all your properties and perhaps having to investigate and do lots of maintenance, maybe. I don't know. However, I suspect this is actually a reducing tax at the moment anyway, as people gradually switch to electric vehicles. So I'm not quite sure where that will go in the future. But anyway, for the moment, it's been frozen again. And there's also a lot of extra infrastructure investment or confirmation of existing infrastructure investment, especially on trains and especially with links in the more northern areas of the country. So if you've got property around there, or if you're considering property around there, it might be good areas to consider investing in where those train links are going to be added. So they will, of course, promote communities and promote property values in those areas. Thank you very much for listening through this shorter episode. And I hope that even if you're not quite as enthusiastic as me about the potential for making tax digital to help everyone in property work more efficiently, I hope you are at least a little more informed about some of the changes that are coming through for landlords who own property in personal names and, of course, have to complete self-assessment tax returns. Thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you again next time.